All right, let's do this. The oracle who named a virus before it had a name. In November of 2000, a figure calling himself John Titor appeared on internet forums and began describing the future. Not in vague poetic symbols, not in the language of prophecy, but in the dry, specific vocabulary of someone filing a report. He described a biological contamination event tied to live animal markets in densely populated urban centers. He described societal fragmentation following a mass illness that moved faster than any government response. He named a window of time, approximately 20 years out. He was posting from a bulletin board. The timestamp is still there. Titor is easy to dismiss. He claimed to be a soldier from 2036 traveling backward through time on a military mission, and that framing gives every skeptic exactly the exit ramp they need. But strip away the time travel claim and look only at what he wrote, and the picture changes. His archived posts describe a pathogen emerging from conditions of urban crowding and human-animal contact, spreading through populations before authorities understood what they were dealing with. He described governments moving too slowly, supply chains fracturing, and individuals losing faith in institutions that could not explain what was happening to them. In 2006, the CDC published its pandemic preparedness framework following the SARS outbreak. The document used language that mapped almost exactly onto Titor's forum posts from 6 years earlier. Zoonotic spillover, wet market transmission vectors, asymptomatic community spread preceding official recognition. The CDC arrived at those conclusions through years of epidemiological fieldwork. Titor had posted the same framework on a public message board in the year 2000. The forum archives at the original Time Travel Institute site preserved every word, time-stamped and unedited. The standard explanation is that Titor was a clever hoaxer who read obscure epidemiological literature and packaged it in science fiction. That explanation is possible. It is also the least interesting thing about the case. Because whether he was a time traveler or a very well-read fraud, the content of what he wrote was not wrong. If he was guessing with the precision of someone who had already seen the answer sheet. And the question that nobody has fully closed is a simple one. Where did he get the answer sheet? Nostradamus and the Invisible Sickness. In 1555, a French apothecary and physician named Michel de Nostradam published a collection of cryptic four-line verses that his contemporaries received with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. The church was uncomfortable. The court of Catherine de' Medici was captivated. Most readers found the verses too obscure to be useful. What almost no one noted at the time was that the man writing these prophecies was not a mystic dabbling in the supernatural. He was a physician who had personally watched plague kill everyone he loved and had spent decades thinking about nothing else. The standard reading of Nostradamus treats the quatrains as a kind of cosmic inkblot test, vague enough to match anything, specific enough to feel eerie in hindsight. That reading misses the professional context entirely. In the 1530s, Nostradamus lost his first wife and both of his children to bubonic plague. He responded not with grief and retreat, but with fieldwork. He traveled through southern France treating the sick, developing sanitation protocols that were decades ahead of official medicine, burning infected clothing, separating the sick from the healthy, insisting on unpolluted water sources. He understood transmission before the word existed in any medical sense. Century 2, Quatrain 53, describes a great plague originating from distant eastern regions, arriving in maritime cities, and moving through populations with a speed that outpaces any conventional response. Interpreters who work with the original Middle French argue the verse encodes a respiratory illness that travels ahead of its own recognition, hitting crowded port cities first and spreading inward. The description fits the progression of nearly every major pandemic of the last 3 centuries, including the most recent one. His fumigation compounds are the quiet evidence that changes the argument. The plants Nostradamus recommended burning during disease outbreaks, including time-derived compounds and specific aromatic resins, have documented antimicrobial properties confirmed in modern laboratory settings. He was not performing ritual. He was doing chemistry without the vocabulary for chemistry. A man who understood disease better than his entire era, writing about a future plague in terms that keep fitting the ones that actually arrive. Either he was the most sophisticated epidemiologist of the 16th century, or he was reading from a different kind of source. The Native American elder who described COVID before the word existed. Thomas Bonacieux was born in 1909 on the Hopi Reservation in Arizona, and he spent the last decades of his life doing one thing: delivering a warning that nobody wanted to hear. He was the official interpreter for the Hopi traditional leaders, selected in 1948 to carry the elders' message to the outside world. In December of 1992, after years of being denied access, he was finally granted the floor of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. He stood at the podium of the most powerful diplomatic body on earth and described, in precise terms, a coming sickness, one that would move invisibly through populations, carried by people who did not feel sick and did not know they were carrying anything at all. The Hopi concept of Koya Aniskatsi, meaning life out of balance, is not a metaphor in the way that Western audiences tend to receive it. Within the Hopi oral tradition, it is a diagnostic term, a description of the specific conditions that produce catastrophic collapse, including collapse through disease. The elders' prophecies, recorded in writing by anthropologist Frank Waters in his 1963 book, include a description of a sickness that no medicine man can cure, arriving when human life has moved too far from its natural order, spreading before it is recognized, and moving through all nations simultaneously. The detail that should not exist in a pre-modern oral tradition is the asymptomatic carrier concept. The idea that a person can carry and transmit a disease while showing no symptoms of illness themselves was not formally identified in Western medicine until the 20th century. It is not a concept that appears in European plague literature of the same era. It does not appear in the standard folklore or myth traditions of most cultures. It appears in the Hopi record, traced back through clan lineages at least 1,000 years, and it appears in exactly the clinical sense that modern epidemiology uses it. Bonacieux died in 1999, 1 year before John Titor appeared on his forums, 21 years before the pandemic arrived. His UN speech transcript is in the official record. The prophecy he was delivering was not his invention. It came from people who had been holding it for a millennium, waiting for the right moment to hand it forward. How does a landlocked desert people develop a 1,000-year-old concept for a disease mechanism that Western medicine only formally identified in the last 100 years? The Black Death Prophecy, hidden in a 14th century manuscript. In the 1340s, a Franciscan friar and alchemist named Johannes de Rupesquissa was locked in a papal prison in Avignon. He had been imprisoned by the very church he served because the things he was writing were considered dangerous. Not heretical in the theological sense, but dangerous in a more immediate way. He was describing, in specific and clinical terms, what was about to happen to the world. The Avignon papacy did not imprison people for writing harmless fictions. They locked away the ones whose ideas threatened order. Within a decade of his imprisonment, the institution that jailed him had lost half its clergy to plague. Rupesquissa's major prophetic text, Vade Mecum in Tribulation, written in 1356, was composed in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death's first wave. But his earlier writings, circulated before the plague's arrival, had already described the coming of a great mortality that would travel along eastern trade routes faster than any army, and that no conventional medicine would be able to stop. The Black Death arrived via the Silk Road. It moved faster than any army. Medieval medicine was helpless against it. The mortality rate across Europe fell between 30 and 60% of the total population, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people dead. What separates Rupesquissa from the category of vague prophets is the institutional response to him. The Avignon papacy read his work carefully enough to consider it worth suppressing. His manuscripts were copied and distributed in secret, surviving in at least 12 known versions across European archives. People were preserving his texts at personal risk. That does not happen with the work of an obvious crank. The detail that lingers is the mortality rate. Rupashisa wrote about a coming sickness that would kill a catastrophic proportion of the population before the Black Death arrived to demonstrate what that proportion looked like. His jailers were dead. His manuscripts were circulating through underground networks, and nobody has ever explained where his numbers came from. He was in a papal prison when the plague began. He had described its scale before it arrived, and the church that imprisoned him used his cell as a filing cabinet for a warning it was not prepared to act on. The Athenian historian who wrote the first pandemic playbook and was ignored for 2,000 years. In 430 BC, a plague moved through Athens so quickly that the bodies of the dead were stacked in the temples because there was no time to bury them. The Athenian statesman Pericles died in it. Roughly 25% of the city's population was gone within 3 years. A historian named Thucydides contracted the illness, survived it, and then did something that no one before him had done. He documented the experience with the clinical detachment of a scientist. What he wrote should have changed medicine permanently. It was not consulted in any serious institutional way for over 2,000 years. Thucydides was not writing mythology or moral allegory. He was writing observation. His account of the Plague of Athens, contained in books 2 through 54 of his History of the Peloponnesian War, describes the symptom progression of a hemorrhagic illness in precise physical sequence. It describes the collapse of social norms in the order that collapse actually occurs during a pandemic. First, the abandonment of the sick, then the breakdown of religious authority, then the erosion of legal compliance as people concluded they were already dying and had nothing left to lose. A 2006 DNA study published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases, working from teeth recovered from a mass grave near Athens, identified Salmonella typhi, typhoid fever, as the most likely pathogen. The observation that should have made Thucydides required reading in every medical school on Earth is his account of survivor immunity. He wrote explicitly that those who had recovered from the illness were seized by a confidence that the disease would not strike them again, and that these survivors became the only people willing to nurse the still sick. That is a clinical description of post-infection immunity. Written in 400 BC. In 2020, epidemiologists studying COVID behavioral patterns published papers noting that Thucydides had documented the same social compliance breakdown in the same sequence. They cited him directly. The playbook had been sitting in university libraries for 2,400 years. If a historian in 430 BC documented asymptomatic transmission dynamics, survivor immunity, and the social collapse sequence of a pandemic in the correct order, why did it take us 2,400 years to check his work? The 16th century physician who modeled epidemic spread. 400 years too early. In 1546, an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro published a book that should have ended the debate about how disease spreads. It was called De Contagione et Contagiosis Morbis, and it contained a complete theoretical framework for epidemic transmission built on nothing but observation and logic. Fracastoro had no microscope. He had no germ cultures. He had no laboratory. He had patients, and he watched them carefully. And what he derived from watching them was so accurate that the World Health Organization's 20th century pandemic transmission framework mirrors it almost exactly. In Fracastoro's era, disease was officially explained through miasma theory, the idea that illness arose from bad air emanating from rotting matter. This was not fringe thinking. It was the consensus of educated European medicine, endorsed by institutions and universities. Fracastoro worked within that institutional world as a celebrated humanist scholar with access to the intellectual network surrounding Pietro Bembo and the University of Padua, the most sophisticated academic environment in 16th century Europe. He knew the official theory. He rejected it. His framework identified three distinct modes of contagion: direct contact between infected and healthy individuals, indirect contact through contaminated objects, what we now call fomite transmission, and transmission at a distance through the air, meaning airborne spread. He ranked these modes by risk level and by geographic reach. Direct contact was most dangerous in proximity. Airborne transmission was less immediately lethal, but moved the furthest and fastest. That ranking is functionally identical to the hierarchy used in modern respiratory pandemic response. He had also, 16 years earlier, written the poem that gave syphilis its name. Syphilis, Sive, Morbus Gallicus, published in 1530, was the first time a disease was formally named in medical literature. The man who named the first formally recognized sexually transmitted disease then spent the next 16 years developing a complete transmission model for respiratory pandemics. He was working on the right problems the entire time. He had the complete framework in 1546. The rest of medicine needed another 300 years and several more pandemics before it was ready to agree with him. The infrastructure to act on correct knowledge is always the last thing to arrive. The 4,000-year-old quarantine protocol carved into clay. 4,000 years ago, in the Sumerian city-state of Ur, administrators were solving the same problem that public health officials faced in 2020. How do you stop an invisible sickness from moving through a population that does not know it is sick? The answer they arrived at, carved into clay tablets in cuneiform script during the Ur III period between approximately 2100 and 2000 BC, was a quarantine system. And when Assyriologists translated those tablets in the 20th century, researchers checked their translations twice because the protocols matched modern public health guidelines with a precision that felt anachronistic. The Babylonian medical tradition, documented extensively in the diagnostic series known as the Sakiku, treated disease through the concept of the Asaku, an invisible force that traveled from person to person and could not be seen, only inferred from its effects. That framing functions as a metaphorical germ theory. The administrative response it generated was not metaphorical at all. Geographic isolation zones, contamination periods during which the sick were separated from the healthy, the burning of infected materials, and a specific isolation duration that appears repeatedly across the tablets: 7 days. 7 days is not a round number. It is not a religiously convenient number in its original Sumerian context. It maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto the median incubation period of several common respiratory pathogens. The Mosaic Law quarantine system, encoded in Leviticus, written centuries after the Sumerian tablets, specifies the same 7-day isolation period and the same protocol of burning infected garments. The Venetian maritime quarantine adopted in 1377 AD, which gave the English language the word quarantine, was derived from Levitical law, which was derived from Sumerian administrative practice. The chain runs in a straight line from a clay tablet in Ur to a harbor checkpoint in medieval Venice to the isolation protocols of 2020. At every link, the core logic is identical. Somewhere at the origin of that chain, someone understood disease transmission precisely enough to derive the right number. Where does a Bronze Age administrator learn that the invisible thing making people sick takes exactly 7 days to reveal itself? The Egyptian medical papyrus that described airborne transmission 3,500 years ago. In 1872, a German Egyptologist named Georg Ebers purchased a papyrus in Luxor. It was over 20 meters long, carefully preserved, and turned out to be the most comprehensive medical document to survive from the ancient world. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BC, and now housed at the University of Leipzig, contains 700 medical prescriptions, diagnoses, and treatment protocols across 110 pages. Most of it reads as sophisticated but familiar. Treatments for infections, instructions for wound care, protocols for specific symptoms. And then, in one passage, translators found something that did not belong to 1550 BC at all. The passage describes a category of illness that spreads through the air in crowded environments, moving from the breath of the sick into the breath of the healthy. The description is not mystical. It does not invoke demons or divine punishment. It describes a mechanism. Translators working with the original hieratic script have consistently rendered the core concept as contagion transmitted through shared breath, a person-to-person respiratory pathway identifiable in purely physical terms. The recommended response is isolation of the afflicted and fumigation of shared spaces using specific plant compounds. Those compounds are where the papyrus becomes quietly extraordinary. The fumigation materials specified include cedar oil and a range of aromatic plant resins, several of which have documented antimicrobial properties confirmed in modern laboratory settings. Thyme-derived compounds, for instance, contain thymol, a natural antiseptic used in modern disinfectants. The Egyptians were not burning incense for ritual purposes in this protocol. They were burning specific materials with specific chemical properties, because they had observed that burning those specific materials reduced the spread of illness. The ritual was the science, and the science was correct. The Ebers Papyrus was almost certainly copied from an older source. Egyptologists estimate the original document dates to the Old Kingdom, somewhere between 2700 and 2200 BC, which means the observation that illness travels on the breath of the sick may be considerably older than the papyrus that preserved it. 3,500 years ago, in a document that now sits in a German university library, someone described airborne respiratory transmission in functional, observational language. They were right, and the mechanism they described was not formally incorporated into Western medical consensus until the 19th century. The Roman physician, who had the pandemic playbook and watched the empire, ignore it. In 166 AD, a plague arrived in Rome from the eastern provinces, carried back by soldiers returning from the Parthian campaigns. It moved through the city with a speed that overwhelmed every existing institution. The emperor's personal physician, a Greek-born doctor named Claudius Galen, was present in Rome when the outbreak began. He documented the symptom progression in clinical detail, recording the full arc of what he observed in texts that survive today, including De Methodo Medendi. Then, by his own account, he left Rome. He returned to his home city of Pergamon. He watched the Antonine Plague kill an estimated 5 to 10 million people across the empire from a distance. Galen is a complicated figure precisely because of that departure. He was arguably the most capable medical mind in the Roman world, and he chose survival over fieldwork at the moment the data was most available. But what he did produce, in the years following the Antonine Plague, was a medical framework of extraordinary scope. His writings on disease progression, population density as a transmission variable, the behavior of illness in military encampments versus civilian populations, and the importance of water source separation constitute something very close to a pandemic response manual. His texts became the foundational authority for European and Islamic medicine for the next 14 centuries. They were mandatory study at European universities until the 17th century. In 249 AD, the plague of Cyprian arrived. At its peak in Rome, ancient sources describe mortality at 5,000 people per day. Historian Kyle Harper, in his 2017 work, The Fate of Rome, argues the Cyprian plague was a primary driver of the political disintegration that followed, hollowing out the military, collapsing the tax base, and accelerating the crisis of the 3rd century that nearly ended the empire. Galen's recommendations for camp spacing, symptom-based isolation, and water source management sat in libraries across the empire, copied and preserved and taught. None of them were institutionally adopted. The gap between documented knowledge and institutional action may be the most dangerous force in human history. Galen had the playbook. The empire that preserved his books in 14 languages burned anyway. If the most powerful empire on Earth owned the right pandemic manual for 300 years and still could not use it, what exactly does that tell us about the distance between knowing something and being able to act on it? The 12,000-year-old warning, carved in stone. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying a hilltop in southeastern Turkey when he realized that what local farmers had been plowing around for decades was not a Byzantine cemetery. It was a complex of massive carved stone pillars, arranged in circles, buried deliberately under tons of rubble. Göbekli Tepe, dated through radiocarbon analysis to approximately 9600 BC at its earliest layers, predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates writing, the wheel, and agriculture as we understand them. And in 2017, a peer-reviewed study in Mediterranean archaeology and archaeometry proposed that the carvings on its most famous feature, the structure known as Pillar 43, encode a precise astronomical record of a catastrophe, a comet impact or airburst event dated to approximately 10,950 BC. That date corresponds to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt global cooling that lasted approximately 1,200 years. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposed by a growing body of researchers and supported by evidence including nanodiamonds and platinum anomalies at geological boundary layers across multiple continents, suggests an extraterrestrial event triggered the climate collapse. The consequences were catastrophic. 35 genera of megafauna went extinct across North America, Europe, and Asia. Human populations were severely reduced across multiple continents. The world that existed before the Younger Dryas and the world that existed after it were not the same world. Pillar 43 depicts a sequence of animal figures that Sweatman and Sakritsis argue function as a star map, encoding the sky as it appeared on a specific date, the date of the impact. Among those figures is a single headless human. No other figure at the site is headless. No other figure at the site is unambiguously human. Researchers interpret that specific detail as a symbol of mass human death, a record of the catastrophe being encoded in permanent stone by people who survived it and wanted to make sure that someone, eventually, would understand what had happened. The deliberate burial is the detail that cannot be explained away. Monuments are abandoned. They are built over. They are quarried for materials. They are not methodically filled with rubble by their own builders. But Göbekli Tepe was. Around 8000 BC, the people who maintained the site filled it in, enclosure by enclosure, with carefully packed rubble, preserving the pillars beneath the surface. Archaeologists have no consensus explanation for why. The site could have been simply abandoned. Instead, it was sealed. They built the oldest temple on Earth 12,000 years ago. They carved the record of a catastrophe into the stone. They encoded a star map of the night sky on the date it happened, and then they buried it. Maybe they were not building a monument. Maybe they were writing a warning. And maybe the only question that matters now is whether we are the civilization they were writing it to. Look at what sits across this list, and the pattern is not subtle. A Franciscan friar in a papal prison. A Hopi elder on the floor of the United Nations. An Athenian historian who survived a plague and wrote down everything he observed. An Egyptian physician encoding disease transmission in a document that may be 5,000 years old. A Sumerian administrator who landed on a 7-day isolation period that modern epidemiology still uses. At every point in human history where a pandemic arrived, someone had already seen it coming. The knowledge existed. The warnings were issued. And with almost mechanical consistency, the institutions that held the information failed to act on it in time. That is not a mystery about the past. It is a description of a recurring pattern that keeps producing the same outcome. The question this channel exists to ask is why we keep inheriting knowledge and losing it. Why the distance between understanding something and doing something about it seems to remain constant regardless of the era. That question deserves more than one video. If it is the kind of question that keeps you watching, subscribe and stay in the archive. The next one goes deeper. Every civilization on this list left a record. The record survived. We are the ones reading it now, which means the warning is still in transit. The only variable is whether we are the ones who finally receive it.